Good afternoon, everyone. We are here today to talk about powerful women. And on our panel today, we have a broad variety of genres featuring powerful women: cozy mysteries, police procedural, suspense, historical fiction, and children's books. Our characters are as diverse in age as they are in topic. And who we have with us here today is M. Kate Allen, who proves that strong women are everywhere, as she writes about them in her elementary school Sticky One series, her middle grade fiction, and her adult novels. Betsy Ashton, her powerful women are grandmothers, middle-aged professionals, and even a female serial killer. She has also written short stories for multiple anthologies and was president of the Virginia Writers Club. Susan Williamson, at the age of 6, got her first horse, Jimmy John. That love affair turned into a writing career. She writes thrillers and mystery cozies and even has a children's book to her credit, too. So welcome, ladies. To start off with, I'd like everyone to briefly describe two of their powerful female characters. I'll kick off. Lucinda Pierce is a homicide detective with facial disfigurement. She is around 40 years old. Libby Clark is a scientist working in a Manhattan Project facility, and she is in her early 20s. Kate?
Thank you, Diane. One of my characters is Angela Bridges. She is 27 years old, and she's entering a urban development contest in the city of Cleveland. Another one of my characters, who's been a big hit with my children in particular and all their friends, is Crystal Winters, and she turns 10 and goes off and rides her new bike out into the woods and discovers a haunted mansion and dares to go inside.
Betsy?
My most recent main character is a woman named Agent Maria Perez. She is a wife, she is a mother, and she's an NCIS agent who works on a task force to solve a horrendous crime that opens on page 3. Another one I wrote, and Diane alluded to it, is my female serial killer. I wrote her on a dare because I had a friend saying, I bet you can't write about a female serial killer, and I did her one better. I did it from the female serial killer's perspective. First person singular, and that was a challenge. I had so much fun writing it. She does have a moral code. It may not be what you, Kate, and Diane and Susan have, but she has her own moral code. And while she kills an awful lot of people, that's not her only distinctive characteristic. So I'll say no more.
Susan?
Okay, I have Madeline Jones, and she is a Afghanistan war widow, and her house explodes, and she barely escapes on horseback with her life. And so she decides she needs to find out what really happened, because she gets a mysterious letter that her husband might not have been killed in the war like she thought. So she goes off in 3 continents looking for answers. Then I also have Molly Lewis. Molly is married, but her husband is away at a horse show, and her help doesn't show up, and she's about to pull out her last hair, and then she finds a body on the trail.
That brightens up everyone's day.
Yes.
So, well, what makes a strong female character? Anyone?
Well, I think it's independence. The fact that they're not dependent on someone else for every action, and they're not. Both of my mysteries are set in the South, but neither character is a Southern belle. They're not simpering. They're not looking. They're not dependent on others for their happiness or their actions or their decisions.
Exactly. They need their own agency to have control of their life. Betsy?
I think they have a strong moral code, and I think that's one of the things that makes them unique. They're curious, they're tenacious. No is not in their vocabulary. So when someone says you can't do that, it's like, here, hold my beer. It's like, it's a dare at that point. But I do think women are often underrated. And I think Susan makes a point. You can write about the South without having fainting and, vapors and Scarlett O'Hara talking about her 16-inch waist. You can have a really strong character who simply happens to live in the South. My characters do not, but I will have one set in Virginia very soon. So that's why I think they're strong.
Excellent. Kate?
I'm going to echo what all three of you said. Susan, I heard you say not simpering. Diane, I heard you say they have agency. And Betsy, I heard you say, before I lose my thought, that they have their own moral code. And in addition to those things, I would say that what makes a strong woman is that she's willing to look at herself and see herself clearly, without shying away from whatever it is that maybe failings on her part. And she pushes through those things so that she can be her very best self.
Yeah, I think that when we're writing about strong women characters, I think we need to look at the character first as a person, someone who has her own goals, her drives and objectives. She's a human. She has cares. She has flaws. And after that, think about what gender that person might be, rather than starting out with the first prerequisite being female. Any thoughts on that? Nope. Okay.
No.
Yes.
I echo that too. And I think maybe that isn't the norm for our culture's framework. But for all of us here, and I've read all of your work, that's definitely what I detect in all of your work, that each woman is her own person and that she has her own goals and her own priorities and her own vision. And she's not afraid to pursue it. And she's certainly not afraid to pursue it because of her gender.
And even Betsy's serial killer, that holds up for too.
Yeah.
Oh, very much so.
Do you victimize your characters? Do you use victimization as a way to present their strengths as they overcome?
I don't want my character to be a victim.
Okay.
I agree with Susan. The NCIS agent in Betrayal is not a victim. She undergoes a tremendous transformation during the course of the novel. What she believes to be true at the beginning is not true at the end. And she's the first one who comes to understand that the killer was sympathetic. And she has to convince her task force that there was a reason why the guy did what he did, even though it was horrific. But I don't think I've ever written about a victim, unless they're overcoming something huge.
I have the victimhood pretty much in the backstory. I think a lot of times when you can see what they've overcome, that does make their strength shine through. And for example, both my two main characters, women, had a horrible trauma in their childhood, and both of them overcame that. And it is part of what makes them want to do good and to help others. They also get a little victimization during the story too. One thing that happens to my homicide detective is she's shot in the face at a domestic violence incident, and my scientist is greatly discriminated on because it's World War II and she's a woman and she's a scientist, and that just doesn't fit in with social standards of that time. Do you have anything to add, Kate?
Yes, I'm going to piggyback off what you just said. And I want to make a distinction, I think, between um, um, victimization and experiencing trauma. I would say that my characters experience really hard, difficult things, but they wouldn't identify as victims in the sense that they aren't going around feeling sorry for themselves. They recognize that they've been through hard things, but they're making the most of those things however they can.
I guess to me, victimization doesn't mean they're wallowing. It means that there's something that they had to fight against. So I wasn't diminishing the character with that word.
Yeah, so in that sense, then I would say
Yeah,
my characters have experienced victimization in that sense, and they push right through, and that is part of why they have such strong
powerful personalities. Yeah.
yeah.
So, have you ever intentionally put some of your personality traits into your characters, or when you finished a manuscript, have you recognized bits of yourself in that character?
Oh, I have never written a snarky character in my life. Every one of my damn women is snarky. I mean, they've got a mouth, they've got strong opinions, and they're not shrinking violets, whether they're in the South or the North or wherever. They're just really vocal women. And so, yeah, that's me.
Well, we know ourselves, hopefully, we know ourselves best. So I think consciously or unconsciously, we're going to put personality traits that we have in our characters, not 100%, but because that colors our view of the world so much. I don't think we can help doing it to some extent.
Exactly. When I first wrote Lucinda Pierce, I had thought that I really liked her, but I wasn't sure if she would like me. But then I realized that thought was really a reflection of my own insecurity as a writer, because I had to realize my strengths and accept them before I could see that some of them were in her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of times, a lot of the writing we do about other women is an exercise in self-exploration.
Sure.
Agreed.
I would say for my work, I see bits of my personality. I've never written a snarky story in my life either. So there are characteristics. I would find a story that was actually about me to be rather not fun to read, and kind of boring. Like, not that my life is boring, but I don't want to read about myself. I would say that while my characters reflect glimmers of me, they are not me, and it's better that way. I don't need to tell about myself.
I've had a number of readers say, "Oh, you should write an autobiography," and I can't tell you how boring that prospect sounds to me.
Yeah, I'm not a memoirist.
I'm more likely to pick a character trait of mine and give it to one of my characters, whether it's male or female. And that because, as Susan said, we know ourselves the best, we think, we hope. I can explore a trait. Maybe it's not one of my finer traits, but I can explore.
Do you want to relate that to the serial killer book?
No. But I may tell you one of these days about Buckshot Betsy.
Oh, I do want to hear about Buckshot Betsy. So when you're writing your book, how important is the place where the story is situated to you?
I'm going to jump on that one. Place is everything in my stories. Places are actually characters in my stories. And I use real places. I find myself very interested in the history of a place, how it's developed, and how a character might fit into that. So that's really evident, especially in Memory Stands Still, where it's set in Cleveland, and she's doing this urban development project where she has to choose a site, and she goes exploring all over Cleveland and discovers a ton of its history. And it's I first became really interested in this idea of place as a character when I visited Berlin when I was in college. And when you look at Holocaust history, for example, place, and especially the literature that comes out after the war and when the wall is there, it's so interesting to see how different people end up having these vastly different stories because of where they are in the same city, which side of the wall they're on, for example. So place is very big in my stories.
Susan?
Well, my cozy mysteries are set on horse farms. So in order to incorporate, in order to move the story along and to incorporate the horse aspect, the immediate place is very, very important. In the thrillers, yes, place is also important, but there are a lot of different places involved. And I did a lot of research. Some of the places I'd been, some of them I had not. Part of it is set in Turkmenistan. And I will admit, I've not been to Turkmenistan. I want to go someday. But I did a lot of research because I needed to incorporate that as a very foreign place to her when she was there.
Betsy?
In my current book that came out at the end of last year, Betrayal, place is essential. The novel opens the first 3 pages with a crime. We think, well, it is a crime. It opens at the Army-Navy game, which is an iconic setting of itself. The game played in Baltimore in 2007. I was there, but I did not, and that's where we divulge from reality. I crash a plane from the flyover at the Army-Navy game. And so the setting is critical because anyone who's ever been to a college football game and sees something in the area of where they're tailgating is going to know there's going to be a lot of carnage. It's going to be really ugly. But then we have to find out why the plane crashed. Was it sabotage? Was it suicide? What was it? And that's where the story is jumping off. But setting it right there, boom, explosion, dead people, panic, got everything started. And then it's much more of a psychological study of how did we find out what was going on in this pilot's head and why did he crash the plane?
So it's easy to understand how you had to have a setting at a football stadium. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to understand how Susan would need to have a horse wrench, or else what does the woman do but just play with the bridle? And on the other hand, Kate, how do you feel as if your setting vitalizes your character?
Well, it's different for each story. And I'm going to point to a different story this time. I wrote a novel called Playing Gauche. It's set in Tempe. And I'm from the Midwest. Tempe is in the Southwest, in the Sonoran Desert, which is where I live now. And coming from the Midwest, which is lush, green, and has deciduous trees everywhere, coming to the desert, the beauty here is not obvious. And this ties very much into the character whom I describe, Medley Blunt. She's adopted. And so she's very much exploring her identity, trying to figure out what is essential to her. And in her exploration of Tempe and discovering bits about the Sonoran Desert, she has to look really closely to see what is essential, what does matter. And is it just this broad view where she's just a person, where the desert is just a bunch of dry air and not much greenery, or is there something more? So in that sense, her exploration of what is really life-giving in the desert, which isn't obvious at first glance, is parallel to her discovery of what is really life-giving and essential in her identity.
When I wrote the book about the Manhattan Project facility with Louis Clark, the setting was absolutely vital. It was important, I thought, for the reader to understand the kind of sacrifices and the things that the people at that facility accepted as a reality, because where they lived at first did not have a name. They could not get mail sent to them. It had to go through a government box. The strangest thing of all to me was that if you were a mother and you had some children who were at home and some who were at school, you had to trust your neighbors so much that if there was an air raid warning and you had to clear out, you only worried about the children that were with you. Then you went to your assigned space to rendezvous, and there you would stop and pick up whatever children were there and take them to the safe zone. And you wouldn't find out till later where your kids were. You wouldn't know for sure if they were safe. But everybody did that. And they could clear that whole place out in 3/4 of an hour. And, here we are today worrying about so much minor things when they gave up so much. And it was so important for so many of them to do something to help the war effort. So that leads me to where I got the idea for that. I was researching a true crime book, actually. And the woman who killed 2 husbands had spent her teenage years in this same facility, but it was after the war. And her father started the museum there. And in doing that research, I got so excited about what was going on in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that I had a hard time putting aside that research to work on what I really needed to work on. But then I worked on it later. And that's where this whole idea of a series came from for me. But what are some of your ways that what did you come up with first, your character or your place? And how did you bring them together? Anyone?
That feels like a chicken and egg question. I'd say with Memory Stands Still, the city came first. I had always been very interested in the city of Cleveland, and I wanted a character that dwelled there. But with playing Gauche, the place actually probably came first with that one too, because I knew I wanted to write a story, and I didn't know how to set it here because at the time I didn't feel connected to this place at all. And I'd say writing this novel was partly an effort to try to connect with the place.
Betsy?
I want to take a little bit of a segue to the side. While this is not typically a mystery, it is a coming of age story, which is also in itself a mystery. Setting came first. My story is set in the high desert of Southern California around Victorville, where I grew up. And yes, you have to look at your feet to see the beauty. You have to look close to see the grains of sand and how they're different, and the lava chunks and all of this. The character actually is a cousin of mine, and I wanted to write his story because he died young and I wanted to give him a life. But he and I grew up together in this desert of Southern California, and Toad was just an incredible young kid. He was 13 when he died, and he was a marvelous. He never had a chance. But we had the desert, and we had thousands of square miles to be free range kids. And so that was a starting point for me. And that openness translated into the adult character who Toad became when he grew up to be Todd. So for me, that was a strange book because I literally started with a setting.
Susan?
Well, here again, the cozy horse farm mysteries are based on real settings. So, I started, well, I had the character in mind, but also had the setting very much in mind together. In the thriller, I came up with the settings as I went. I had the character in mind from the very beginning, but I write definitely chapter by chapter, and I wasn't sure where we were going, what part of the world even until the next chapter. So the settings definitely were secondary in the thriller series.
Well, the first one I talked about, it was definitely a place thing. But then my Lucinda Pierce series, it really was a person thing, because the character had to come first, because I was inspired by a blog post by someone with a facial disfigurement who was agonizing over the fact that only bad guys have facial disfigurement in fiction and books and movies. And so I knew I needed to have someone who had facial disfigurement. It just seemed very important to me because there were people out there who needed that validation. And so that's where she came from. Now, place can overpower a character if you're not careful, but I'll never forget my first novel about Molly Mullet. And I wrote about that because of a singular experience I had sitting in Green Hall, which is the oldest music hall in Texas, watching a guy up on stage on a stool playing an acoustic guitar. And I start watching him playing, and a thought struck me. Could you kill someone with a guitar string? And that's how that story evolved. And I found that, yes, musicians were very cooperative, with suggesting which was the best string to use to commit murder.
Things writers think about.
Yes.
You do not want to live in my head.
We do not. None of us want the FBI looking at our screen searches. That's for sure.
Right.
So, someone asked here is, how do you keep the this place from overwhelming your character to make it more than just a travel log? How do you work that?
Well, you have to do a lot of, you have to show what your character is thinking, I think, and how the environment is affecting her, and also how she's thinking about the whole story. So then the setting becomes the background for that, but it doesn't obliterate that. So.
Well, one thing when I was writing true crime, I noticed that there was something about every real crime that had a direct connection to the place where it happened. Mm-hmm. There was so much going on around that either made that crime happen there, or the way the community reacted and the pain they felt afterwards. So it was, to me, you've got character and place almost need to go hand in hand. What about a love interest? Do you think that a strong female character should have a love interest?
No. I don't shit on my characters.
Well, what if they do? I mean, how do you handle that? I mean, when
I would say I don't think a character should, but it doesn't mean that my characters don't. Okay. My characters sometimes have love interests, but it's not primary. It's always a secondary subplot going on, because my characters have higher priorities than romance, always.
And unless we're talking about love of horses, Susan, you would probably say the same. Well, no, I mean, I don't think I don't think it's necessary, is what I guess I'm trying to say. But my one character is married, and that's a part of who she is. So her love interest there is part. And the other character, of course, she's a widow, but she does meet someone, and she agonizes over whether or not, over a long period of time, whether or not it's time to move on. It's not that she's looking for romance. It just happens to, their paths intersect, and spends a lot of time analyzing that. And that person, because of their law enforcement connections, is important to the story. So that, but could I have written the story without that? Yeah, I don't think it would have been as appealing, though.
Betsy?
Well, I was thinking about my first series, my only series, my Mad Max series. Max is a widow 3 times over. So she's buried 3 husbands, all natural causes, no murders. She's
What a pity.
rich. I know. Well, I made up for it in the serial killer book. She has a strong family. She gets into scrapes. She's very wealthy. She's very blonde. She's very, very snarky. And she ends up falling in love with a Mexican American from right out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it is the most wonderful love story, but it's not a love story. It's just adults getting together. It is important because they are friends first. She leans on him when she needs to. He leans on her when he needs to. So I like the balance of Max and Johnny together, because they complemented each other.
I think sometimes a love interest is used to be the person that provides support, but there are a lot of other ways you can provide support. I mean, a good friend could be the support, or a good friend could turn to be a love interest later on in a series. I've done it both ways. Any more thoughts on that?
I think of my middle school characters and playing Gauche, where there's Medley and then her best friend, and there's a whole scene where there's this whole thought process that Medley goes through about whether or not she would ever want to be interested in this objectively attractive person, and she's not interested. It's not her jam, but they are amazing supports for one another without romance.
Yeah. I've talked to male readers, and this surprised me, who have said they like a thriller, but they like a little bit of a romance on the back burner. And that surprised me coming from men, but I've heard it more than once.
Interesting.
It sounds so womanly.
Well, but I mean, think of Ian Fleming. I mean, there were
True.
James Bond. It wasn't the same love interest, but there always were love interests.
There always was, yeah. True.
And a lot of the current suspense and thriller novels often have a woman involved. The main character is almost always male, but I don't sense that the women are simply there because they have to have sex off the page. I find it's they serve a purpose. It may not be the purpose I would want, but a lot of the modern thrillers, you can pick any of the top thriller writers, often have a passing interest in a woman or their partners.
What do you do when you have 2 female strong characters in one book? How do you make them both appear strong while if they're in conflict?
I'll go and say that's the novel I'm writing right now. It has 2 main female characters. They're very strong women. And the way I'm handling it, at least in this stage of it, is to go back and forth between their perspectives so that you can get a vision of what their thought processes are. I think it's easy to diminish a character if you never get their first person perspective. So I move back and forth.
Any other thoughts on that?
I try to give enough backstory on a character that you kind of know why they're acting like they are, and even if they're villains, to give a little kind of explanation for why they feel the way they do, and that certainly would include other female, protagonists. So I don't, the conflict. I mean, my main character is going to always, there's going to be a lot more about her, but at the same time, I think there's going to be some background that indicates the choices that the others make, if that makes sense.
So here's my question. I'm thinking nobody can see me right now because I can't find where you went.
Oh, we're here. We can
We're
see
here.
you.
We see you.
Hi.
I've lost my screen. Okay, well, we'll just go along and not worry about that for now. Oh, there it is. Got it. Okay. Do you think there's anything that a woman brings to the table to solve a mystery that would be different than a male detective doing the investigation?
I'll take that, because I think the male detective oftentimes, and this is going to be a real stereotype, is only interested in the facts, ma'am. Whereas the female lead is more likely to use different senses, perhaps a little bit more intuitive senses. At least that's when I think about writing a character solving a crime. Maria in Betrayal definitely was the psychological protagonist. There are other women in the story, but they're not as important. So I do think that there is a different perspective that a female character brings to a male-dominated world, like solving crimes.
Anyone else?
I think too, they're more apt, not, you can't generalize, but they're more apt to look at personalities and emotions probably than some of the male characters are. And here again, that's stereotyping, and that doesn't mean there aren't sensitive males and so forth. But I do think they tend to look a little bit more behind the scenes, like you said, not just the facts, and look into the characters and backgrounds and motivations, I guess, of all the characters, and to realize, what might be going on behind the scenes.
And how would you say that helps in the story making?
Well, when they're considering the possible suspects, say, they're not going to automatically rule somebody out as quickly, I don't think, because they're going to look for what else could have motivated this, and I don't think, however, they're equally likely to be caught by surprise, I suppose, but they're going to kind of rationalize it out to figure it out. I don't know. I don't know that. I just think it's a way of perceiving the world that's a little different.
Yes, we don't want to say that we are, as women, are better at that, because that would be gauche. But
Right.
True, though.
So if you have, let's say you have two strong women and they're of different generations, or they're in different social worlds or different businesses, how do you find ways to bridge the gap to get them working as a team?
Oh.
Well, for me, when different characters are coming together, it often means taking a look into both of their worlds and seeing where there might be bridges. And sometimes it means building bridges as part of the plot. So in the novel I'm currently writing, the kind of work that my two main characters do, very different. And at least early in the novel, there's no way for them to understand one another exactly, at least not through their work. But then they discover that they have mutual interests, and they develop their connection through their mutual interests.
In real life, I've often
So-
been shocked by what people have thought about my motivations in a situation, because it isn't what my motivations were. And I think that's the big barrier, that people tend to perceive the world in a certain way and assume that you do too. So if someone is trying to manipulate you, they assume that you're going to try to manipulate them.
Mm.
So I think that there's always conflicting motivations when any two characters come together. The reason they do come together.
And it's interesting
And-
to
go ahead,
explore
Kate.
that, isn't it, as part of the story, to discover where motivations may be different, because it isn't always obvious at first.
Right. Or sometimes it's obvious, then it's obviously wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Diana,
what would you
Diane?
tell somebody who wanted to develop a character for a novel? What is your best advice to them?
I'd say to look around at real people you admire and, ask yourself what it is about them that you admire, and people that you think are strong. And then, kind of think about, and it may be a combination of two or three people, but they have characteristics that you find appealing and that serve them well in getting through situations. So I think then you can, model your character on some of those people. And I think that helps you to kind of put things together, to think, well, what about them? How do they do that? How do they cope with that? And that sort of thing.
I would affirm that I also take that approach, Susan. I look for people I admire and I draw from their personalities or things that they do. I also look for people that I don't find so appealing. And often what I don't find appealing in somebody else becomes a really rich treasure trove of material for me to explore, because not only does it make fodder for characters that aren't as likable, but it's also an opportunity for me to explore my own mess,
Right.
which I'm being judgy.
Yeah.
and that can lead to a much more balanced character who isn't just good or just bad, but
Right.
a bit of both.
Betsy?
I have two female characters in my work in progress, a mother and a daughter. When the story opens, the mother has been killed, not murdered. She was killed in an auto accident, leaving the husband and the daughter to go forward. But she is an ever-present piece of their lives. She's not a ghost. She's just there. The daughter is really going to be the strongest female character I think I've written in a long time, and she is 5 years old. 5. 5. But she is, and I don't want her just to be precocious. I want her to be 5. I want her to do 5-year-old things. But she's also, as the daughter of a mother who was killed in the line of her work, she has to come to grips with it, and she has to help her dad through while he's helping her through. So for me, it's a little bit different on this book. I've never tried to write a child this young, but I'm having fun with it. And it's like Susan says, I watch a lot of little kids. No, I'm not a stalker. No, I'm not hanging out at the park. I just came back from 3 weeks at the beach, and little kids have their own way of viewing the world. It's like this. They don't see anything but this. And so I have to get this little girl, Maggie Rose, to start seeing something a little wider as she's going to grow through the course of the book.
Well, how important do you think is to take these strong women and give them an Achilles heel?
Oh, I think it's critical. I think the flaw is what makes them interesting, whether they're likable or not. I mean, my serial killer is not likable. She friggin' kills people on a regular basis, pretty grimly. But
I didn't like her, Betsy, in case you
I
were
didn't think so.
wondering.
I knew that. She's not likable, but she's interesting. And I think when there is an Achilles heel, that flaw can make a character interesting, even if you despise the character.
Betsy, I will say that I was totally sucked in to your serial killer novel.
Were you really?
Yes, and I like that. I feel like there's value in that distinction between likability and appeal. She's a very appealing character, but not likable.
Hey, anyone with a name that thing is not going to be likable.
But I love that idea of the Achilles heel being totally vital, because if somebody doesn't have one, then what is the story going to be about?
Where's the
Right.
conflict? Where's the tension?
And plus, it's not somebody you can relate to because we all have one.
Right,
Mhm.
exactly.
So let's see. We have some questions. And anybody else, you want to send in questions? We'll get to as many of them as we can. What are your thoughts on motherhood? What are your thoughts on motherhood as part of a strong female's character?
Well, I think, a lot of the strongest females out there are mothers, and they're fighting for their children. So
Mhm.
certainly that can be a part of it,
I would say that motherhood is not essential to a strong character, but as a mother of two amazing young females, I'd say it's certainly not in conflict.
Right.
Well, with my characters, although neither Lucinda nor Libby were mothers, they both had strong mothers in their background who made a big impact on them. And so, in that sense, motherhood was part of the story, even though my characters weren't mothers.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. Okay, so someone else wants to know if you can, how do you create a character that people are interested in without making them a stereotypical beauty?
I think, Diane, you did that with
Yes.
Lucinda.
Yes. Well, it was one side of her face that was seriously flawed. She'd been hit with a sideways shotgun blast. She lost an eye, and she was really got a lot of grief from a lot of people because of that. Because if you see her from one side, she looked perfectly normal, and then when you see the other side, a lot of particularly sexist type of men would be appalled. Anyone else on that?
I would offer that I often try to make sure that my characters don't just fit a stereotypical anything, but especially a beauty standard. So, for example, a number of my characters are not skinny, they're not thin. And so the descriptions of them celebrate their curviness, for example. So that's one example, but I try not to make them just blend. They always stand out in some way.
And my characters are not, yes, they care about their appearance, but it's not an overreaching writing factor of their existence. So, there are snippets where they might describe, oh God, I need a haircut or something, to say that they're not, that isn't the be all end all, their appearance. They're not ugly, but they're not beauty queens either. So,
I actually don't spend very much time talking about how a character looks, even with Mad Max. It was a long time before I even mentioned she had blonde hair in the first book, because it was not essential to reveal it until a certain point. It was more essential to have her throw a mink coat on a chair in a restaurant on the first page and piss off a lot of people. I did.
So what do you think is different about your characters from the ones that maybe you read in other mass market fiction? What makes yours stand out?
My
I
characters
have a good
use
elevator speech for that.
I think
We all
my-
need that elevator speech.
yeah,
Betsy?
we do. I think my characters stand out because they use their brains first and their looks second. They all want to be known for how clever they are without them saying it, but by showing how clever they are, how smart they are, how they put the pieces of the puzzles together, etc. They are much more cerebral, and that's where I would answer that question.
Yeah, I would think the same thing, that they're smart women, and they're not overly worried about what someone else thinks about them.
Bingo.
You know, that's it.
Yeah. Confidence.
I had a thought as you all were speaking, and I think of my children's fiction, and my children's fiction is very different from the children's fiction I grew up with, for example. And I'd say that the main difference is that they're extremely brave. They're not held back by anything. And they'll just go explore, and they get into some dangerous situations too. And there's nothing holding them back, which is pretty unusual for female characters, I think, in kids literature.
Well, it is wrap up time, ladies. It has been a pleasure to meet and talk with all of you this afternoon. And I want you to all keep writing. And I want to say a big thank you to Katie and to the Suffolk Mystery Authors Festival and all the people that are involved in it. It is a great event, and I cannot wait till it's live again and we can actually be really face to face.
That will be so good.
Yes. So
Thank
thank you. And we'll wrap it up and say goodbye to all the audience out there. And thank you too for showing up.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.